The sun hadn't yet crested the downtown San Antonio skyline when James Mitchell made his way down Commerce Street, his prosthetic leg creating a subtle but distinct rhythm against the weathered concrete. The early October morning carried a crisp edge that reminded him of better times, back when autumn meant football seasons and family gatherings instead of sleepless nights and phantom pain that no medication could touch. Heritage Square sat nestled between two towering office buildings like a forgotten memory, a small pocket of green space that the city planners had preserved more out of obligation than love. Most mornings, James had the place entirely to himself, just him, the weathered bronze statue of some long-dead civic leader, and the pigeons that had grown accustomed to his presence. He settled onto his usual bench, the one with the slightly loose armrest that he'd learned to favor his left side against. From his worn canvas messenger bag, he pulled out his father's old Martin D28, the guitar that had somehow survived both his tours overseas and the long, dark months that followed his medical discharge. The instrument bore the scars of its journey. A small crack along the sound hole, finish worn smooth where his right hand had rested through countless hours of playing, fret marks that told stories he couldn't quite bring himself to speak aloud. James ran his fingers along the familiar neck, muscle memory guiding him through a quick tuning that his ears could detect even in the ambient noise of early morning traffic. The ritual grounded him, provided structure to days that otherwise threatened to slip away like sand through his fingers. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had encouraged him to find healthy coping mechanisms during their sessions at the VA hospital, though he doubted she'd had in mind a daily concert for an audience of urban wildlife and the occasional homeless person cutting through on their way to somewhere else. The first chord rang out clear and true in the morning air, a simple G that seemed to expand beyond the confines of the small square. James closed his eyes and let his voice find its way into the familiar territory of George Strait's Amarillo Morning. The song had become his anthem of sorts, not because it held any particular meaning related to his military service, but because it spoke to a longing for simpler times, for wide open spaces where a man could breathe without feeling the weight of invisible walls closing in around him. Amarillo morning, up from the ground, you know the sun is painting the clouds with a golden brown. His voice, roughened by years of shouting orders over helicopter rotors and desert winds, carried a gravelly authenticity that no studio polish could replicate. Each word came from somewhere deep inside, a place that had learned to transform pain into something that could, if not heal, at least provide temporary relief. A young mother pushing a stroller paused at the edge of the square, her infants fussing, quieted by the unexpected melody. She lingered for nearly the entire song, swaying slightly as if the music had awakened some dormant memory of her own. When James finished, she offered a small wave before continuing on her way, leaving him with the familiar mixture of gratitude and embarrassment that came with acknowledgement. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm. A few office workers cut through the square on their way to the nearby federal building, most too absorbed in their phones or their hurry to notice the impromptu concert. James didn't mind the inattention. In fact, he preferred it. The music wasn't for them anyway. It was for the part of himself that had gotten lost somewhere between Kandahar and the sterile corridors of the Walter Reed Medical Center, the part that remembered what it felt like to be whole. By 9:30, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the bench beside him, and James allowed himself a moment to simply sit without playing. His left hand, the one that still worked exactly as it should, traced patterns on the guitar's body, while his right hand, the one that had been rebuilt with pins and plates and the kind of surgical precision that left him grateful and bitter in equal measure, rested against his thigh. The phantom pain in his missing leg had been particularly brutal the night before, keeping him awake until nearly 3 in the morning. He'd finally given up on sleep and spent the remaining hours before dawn reading about new prosthetic technologies on his laptop, a ritual that had become both hopeful and torturous. The advances were remarkable, truly, but they all required the kind of money that didn't come with a military disability pension, no matter how generously the government calculated his monthly allotment. "Morning, James." The voice belonged to Tommy Rodriguez, who owned the coffee cart that set up on the corner of Commerce and Navarro every weekday morning. Tommy had been making the trek across the square to greet him for the better part of 3 months now, ever since the day James had helped him fix a broken wheel on his cart. It was a small kindness that had somehow blossomed into something approaching friendship, though James remained cautious about letting people too close. "Morning, Tommy. How's business?" "Can't complain. You want your usual?" No, Tommy held up a steaming cup that James knew would contain black coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, sweetened with exactly 1 packet of brown sugar. It was a small luxury that he'd come to depend on, this gesture of normalcy in a world that often felt tilted off its axis. "That'd be great, thanks." James accepted the cup with genuine gratitude, wrapping both hands around its warmth. "You're early today." Maria had a doctor's appointment. Routine stuff, but you know how it is. Tommy's wife of 15 years had been battling diabetes, a fact he'd shared during one of their brief morning conversations. These small revelations of ordinary struggle somehow made James feel less isolated in his own difficulties. "Mind if I listen for a minute? That last song always reminds me of my grandfather. He used to sing it while he worked on cars in his garage back in Laredo." James nodded and settled the guitar back into position. This had become part of their morning routine as well. Tommy would bring coffee, James would play a song or two, and they'd exchange the kind of small talk that filled the spaces between larger truths. It wasn't therapy exactly, but it was something, and something was more than James had experienced in the months immediately following his discharge. He launched into Check Yes or No, another George Strait classic that seemed to capture a particular brand of American optimism that James remembered from his childhood, but struggled to access in his current circumstances. Tommy smiled and nodded along, occasionally humming harmony in a surprisingly pleasant tenor. When the song ended, Tommy applauded briefly before checking his watch. "I should get back. The office crowd will be wanting their caffeine fix soon." He paused, as if considering whether to say more. "You ever think about playing anywhere else? I mean, you're really good. Better than some of the guys who play down at the Riverwalk for tips." It wasn't the first time someone had suggested James take his music beyond the confines of Heritage Square, but the idea still made him uncomfortable. Playing here, in this forgotten corner of the city, felt safe. It was contained, controlled, manageable. The thought of performing for strangers who might have expectations or opinions felt overwhelming in a way that he couldn't quite articulate, even to Dr. Martinez during their weekly sessions. "I like it here," he said simply, and Tommy nodded as if he understood. "Well, if you ever change your mind, you let me know. I've got a cousin who books acts at some of the smaller venues around town. Nothing fancy, but honest work for honest music." Tommy raised his hand in a brief wave and headed back toward his cart, leaving James alone with his thoughts and his guitar. The morning continued its familiar pattern. A few more songs, a brief conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Davis, an elderly woman who walked her ancient cocker spaniel through the square every day at 10:15 sharp, and then the gradual retreat into his own thoughts as the city woke up around him. By 11, the sun had grown warm enough that James could feel it through his flannel shirt, and he knew it was time to head home. His apartment was a 15-minute walk from the square, located in a complex that had been built in the 70s and showed every year of its age. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors were quiet, and it was close enough to the VA hospital that he could walk to his appointments when his prosthetic was giving him trouble. It wasn't much, but it was his, and after months of feeling like a guest in everyone else's space, hospital rooms, his sister's spare bedroom, temporary housing, having his own place had felt like a significant victory. James spent the afternoon as he spent most afternoons, reading, watching old westerns on cable television, and working through the physical therapy exercises that were supposed to help with his balance and strength. Dr. Martinez had prescribed the routine not just for his physical recovery, but as a way of creating structure in days that could otherwise drift by without purpose or meaning. Around 3 o'clock, he called his sister Catherine in Houston. It was another part of his routine, a way of maintaining connection with the family that had supported him through the worst of his recovery. Catherine answered on the second ring, as she always did, and they spent 20 minutes discussing her job at the elementary school, where she taught 4th grade, her husband Mike's latest project, restoring their 1967 Mustang, and the ordinary details of life that James sometimes envied and sometimes found comforting. "How are you doing, really?" Catherine asked near the end of their conversation, a question that had become ritual between them. She always asked, and he always answered with some variation of getting better, and they both understood that the truth was more complicated than either of them could fully express in a phone call. "Getting better," he said, and it wasn't entirely untrue. The dark days that had followed his return stateside were behind him now, replaced by something that resembled routine, if not quite normalcy. "I've been playing more. Music, I mean." "That's good, James. Dad would be happy to know you're using his guitar." Their father had died 5 years earlier, just before James's second deployment, and the guitar had been his final gift to his son. At the time, James had been too focused on military life to appreciate the gesture. Now, it felt like a lifeline to something larger than his current circumstances. After ending the call, James returned to his guitar, working through some finger-picking exercises that helped keep his right hand flexible despite the lingering effects of his injuries. The doctors had done remarkable work rebuilding the bones and tendons that had been shattered by shrapnel, but the hand would never be quite the same. Still, it could hold a pick and find the frets, and for that he was more grateful than he could express. Evening came early in October, and James prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring another morning at Heritage Square, another opportunity to lose himself in music for a few hours before the weight of the day settled around his shoulders. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself when he'd enlisted at 19, full of purpose and certainty about his place in the world. But it was his life, and he was learning to find meaning in its smaller moments. As he drifted toward sleep, James could hear the distant sound of traffic on Interstate 35, a constant hum that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Somewhere in that sound, he could almost imagine the vast spaces that George Strait sang about, places where a man could drive for hours without seeing another soul, where the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions and problems seemed smaller under such an enormous sky. Sarah Williams had never intended to become a journalist who specialized in human interest stories, but 5 years after graduating from the University of Texas at Austin, she'd discovered that she had a particular talent for finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. Working for the San Antonio Express-News wasn't exactly the career in investigative reporting she'd dreamed of, but it paid the bills and occasionally provided her with stories that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with journalism in the first place. The assignment that brought her to Heritage Square on that particular Thursday morning was routine enough. The city council was considering a proposal to renovate several downtown green spaces, and her editor wanted a piece about how these areas were currently being used by the community. It was the kind of local government story that would run on page 6 and be forgotten by the weekend, but Sarah approached it with the same thoroughness she brought to all her work. She'd arrived at the square around 8:30, armed with her camera and a list of questions for anyone who might be willing to talk about the space. What she hadn't expected was to find a man sitting alone on a bench, playing guitar and singing with such raw emotion that she found herself stopping in her tracks before she'd even entered the square proper. From her position near the entrance, partially concealed behind a large oak tree that had somehow survived decades of urban development, Sarah watched and listened as the veteran, she could tell from his bearing and the way he carried himself, even seated, worked through what sounded like George Strait's entire catalogue. His voice carried across the empty space with surprising power, each song delivered with the kind of authenticity that no amount of studio production could manufacture. Sarah had grown up listening to country music in the small East Texas town where her grandmother lived, and she recognized quality when she heard it. This wasn't karaoke or casual strumming. This was someone who understood music from the inside out, who could make a familiar song sound both comforting and heartbreaking at the same time. She pulled out her phone and began recording, not with any particular plan in mind, but because her instincts as a journalist told her she was witnessing something worth preserving. The man seemed completely absorbed in his music, unaware of her presence or of anything beyond the boundaries of his performance. There was something almost sacred about the moment, and Sarah found herself holding her breath between songs, as if any sound might break the spell. After about 20 minutes, the singer took a break, and Sarah got her first clear look at his face. He was older than she'd initially thought, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of hard experience. When he shifted position on the bench, she noticed the prosthetic leg and felt a pang of recognition. She'd written several stories about veterans returning from overseas conflicts, and she understood that she was looking at someone whose sacrifices had been significant and largely invisible to the general public. The interaction with the coffee cart owner provided another piece of the puzzle. The easy familiarity between the two men suggested that this wasn't a one-time occurrence, that the veteran's presence in the square was part of a routine that had developed over time. Sarah made a mental note of the coffee cart's location, thinking she might approach the owner later for more information. When the veteran began playing again, Sarah continued recording, capturing several complete songs. She found herself particularly moved by his rendition of Amarillo Morning, which he performed with such longing that she had to blink back unexpected tears. This wasn't entertainment, it was something deeper, more personal, a man working through emotions that couldn't be expressed in ordinary conversation. By the time the veteran packed up his guitar and left the square, Sarah had recorded nearly 40 minutes of material and filled several pages of her notebook with observations. She followed him at a discreet distance, noting which direction he walked and making educated guesses about where he might live based on the neighborhoods in that part of the city. Back at the Express News office, Sarah found herself distracted from her original assignment by the footage she'd captured. She uploaded the videos to her computer and watched them several times, each viewing revealing new layers of emotion and technical skill. The man wasn't just a talented amateur. He was a genuinely gifted musician who happened to be performing for an audience of pigeons and the occasional passerby. Working on the Park story? Her colleague David Chen peered over her shoulder at the screen, where the veteran was frozen mid-song, his face lifted toward the camera with an expression of complete vulnerability. "Among other things," Sarah said, quickly minimizing the video window. She wasn't ready to share what she'd found, not until she understood it better herself. That evening, Sarah found herself researching everything she could about veterans' issues, PTSD, music therapy, and the challenges faced by returning service members. The statistics were sobering. High rates of unemployment, homelessness, suicide, and substance abuse among veterans, particularly those who had served in combat roles. The more she read, the more she understood that the man in Heritage Square represented thousands of others who were struggling to find their place in civilian life. She also researched George Strait, discovering that the country music legend had a strong history of supporting veterans' causes and military charities. Several articles mentioned his deep respect for service members and their families, which made Sarah wonder how he might react to seeing one of his songs performed with such profound personal meaning. The idea came to her gradually, taking shape over several days of additional visits to Heritage Square. Each morning, she arrived early enough to witness the veterans' performance, building up a substantial collection of recordings, while also gathering information about his routine and the small community of people who had come to know him in the square. Tommy Rodriguez, the coffee cart owner, proved to be a valuable source of information. He was initially suspicious of Sarah's questions, but when she explained that she was a journalist, interested in telling positive stories about veterans, he opened up about his friendship with James Mitchell. The first time Sarah had learned the veteran's name. "He's a good man," Tommy told her during a brief conversation while James was playing on the other side of the square. "Been through hell, you can see it in his eyes, but he's working on getting better. The music seems to help him, you know, gives him something to focus on that isn't all about what he lost over there." Tommy also provided crucial context about James's situation. He lived alone in a nearby apartment complex, received disability benefits from the VA, and had been coming to the square for several months. He'd mentioned being wounded in Afghanistan, but hadn't shared details about his service or his injuries beyond what was visible. "You thinking about writing a story about him?" Tommy asked, and Sarah could hear the protective note in his voice. "Maybe," she admitted, "but I'd want to make sure it was the right kind of story, you know? Something that honors what he's been through and what he's doing now." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. He doesn't talk much about the past, but I get the sense he's not looking for pity. Pride's important to guys like him. "Whatever you write, it should respect that." Sarah took those words to heart as she continued developing her plan. She'd covered enough stories about veterans to understand that many of them were wary of media attention, particularly if it focused on their struggles rather than their strengths. What she'd witnessed in Heritage Square wasn't a story about a broken man seeking sympathy. It was a story about resilience, about finding ways to heal and connect despite tremendous challenges. Over the course of 2 weeks, Sarah compiled what she considered to be the best of her recordings, editing them into a single video that showcased both James's musical talent and the emotional depth of his performances. She chose "Amarillo Morning" as the centerpiece, bracketed by portions of 2 other songs that demonstrated his range and skill. The video was just under 4 minutes long, carefully edited to protect James's privacy while still conveying the power of what she'd witnessed. She didn't include any identifying information about the location or the veteran's identity, instead focusing the viewer's attention on the music itself and the raw emotion behind it. Sarah had initially planned to use the video as part of a larger article about how public spaces served the community, but the more she watched it, the more convinced she became that it deserved a wider audience. Social media had become a powerful tool for sharing stories that might otherwise go unnoticed, and she had a sense that James's story could resonate with people far beyond San Antonio. She created social media accounts specifically for sharing the video, crafting a simple caption that read, "A veteran finds healing through music in a quiet corner of the city. Sometimes the most beautiful concerts happen for the smallest audiences." She included hashtags related to veterans, country music, and Texas, then held her breath as she hit the share button. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had been shared hundreds of times, with comments pouring in from viewers who were moved by James's performance. Many of the responses came from other veterans who recognized something familiar in the man's story, while others were simply music lovers who appreciated the authenticity of his voice and style. By the end of the first day, the video had accumulated thousands of views and shares across multiple platforms. Sarah found herself checking her phone constantly, amazed by the reach that the simple recording had achieved. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, with many viewers expressing desire to know more about the veteran and his story. On the third day after posting the video, Sarah received a message that made her heart skip a beat. It came from an account verified as belonging to George Strait's official management team, asking if she had any additional information about the veteran in the video and whether there might be a way to contact him. Sarah stared at the message for several long minutes, hardly believing what she was reading. She'd hoped that the video might bring some positive attention to James's situation, perhaps connecting him with other veterans or music lovers in the community. She'd never imagined that it might reach the attention of George Strait himself. She crafted a careful response, explaining that she was a journalist who had discovered the veteran performing in a public space and had been moved to share his story. She provided some general information about James's situation while respecting his privacy, and offered to serve as an intermediary if George Strait was interested in making contact. The reply came back within hours. George Strait would very much like to meet the veteran, and his team was prepared to make arrangements for a visit to San Antonio if that could be arranged. They asked for Sarah's phone number and suggested a conference call to discuss the details. As Sarah prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her journalistic career, she realized that her simple assignment to write about city parks had evolved into something much larger. She'd stumbled upon a story that touched on themes of service, sacrifice, healing, and the unexpected ways that art could connect people across vast distances of experience and circumstance. The challenge now would be approaching James Mitchell with this extraordinary opportunity while respecting his privacy and his right to choose how his story was told. Sarah had learned enough about the veteran to understand that he valued his anonymity and his quiet routine. The last thing she wanted to do was disrupt the healing process that he'd found in Heritage Square. But she also understood that sometimes the most important stories were the ones that found their way into the world despite our attempts to keep them private. James's music had touched thousands of people already, and if George Strait was willing to travel to San Antonio to meet him, there might be possibilities for connection and support that neither of them could currently imagine. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing her notes and recordings, preparing for a conversation that could change everything for the veteran who had unknowingly become the center of a story much larger than either of them had anticipated. James noticed the changes gradually, like subtle shifts in the weather that you don't recognize until the storm is already overhead. It started with a few more people lingering around Heritage Square during his morning performances, individuals who seemed to be paying closer attention than the usual passers-by. At first, he attributed it to the changing season. October had given way to November, and the cooler air might have made the square more comfortable for people taking breaks from their office routines. But by the second week of November, the patterns had become too obvious to ignore. A young couple sat on the bench opposite his usual spot, the woman occasionally holding up her phone in his direction. Two men in business suits took an unusually long route through the square, pausing to listen to entire songs before continuing to wherever they were headed. Even Mrs. Davis seemed to be lingering longer during her daily dog walk, and James caught her smiling at him in a way that suggested she knew something he didn't. The shift in attention made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. For months, the square had been his sanctuary precisely because it allowed him to be invisible while still being present in the world. The music had been his private therapy session, shared only with the pigeons and the occasional friendly stranger like Tommy Rodriguez. Now he felt watched, evaluated, and the familiar anxiety that he'd worked so hard to manage began creeping back into his daily routine. "You're getting popular," Tommy mentioned on a Tuesday morning as he delivered James's usual coffee. There was something in his tone that suggested he knew more about the situation than he was letting on. "What do you mean?" James accepted the cup with hands that were slightly less steady than usual, a physical manifestation of the unease he'd been feeling. "People been asking about you. That journalist lady came by yesterday wanting to know if I'd seen you, said she had something important to discuss." Tommy settled onto the bench beside James, abandoning his usual routine of quick pleasantries before returning to his coffee cart. "Seem nice enough, but I figured you should know." The word journalist hit James like a physical blow. In his experience, journalists were interested in veterans for one of two reasons. Either they wanted to write inspirational stories that reduced complex human experiences to simple narratives of triumph over adversity, or they wanted to focus on the problems, the PTSD, the substance abuse, the struggles with reintegration, that made for compelling but ultimately exploitative reading. Did she say what she wanted? James tried to keep his voice neutral, but Tommy's expression suggested he wasn't entirely successful. "Something about a video, said she'd been watching you play and thought people should know about your music." Tommy paused, studying James's reaction. "You didn't know about it?" James felt the familiar tightness in his chest that Dr. Martinez had taught him to recognize as the beginning of an anxiety response. Someone had been recording him without his knowledge, sharing his private moments of healing with strangers on the internet. The thought made him feel exposed and violated in a way that he struggled to process. "No," he said simply. "I didn't know." Tommy nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Like I said, she seemed nice, professional, but if you don't want to talk to her, that's your business. I can tell her you're not interested." The offer was tempting, but James knew that avoiding the situation wouldn't make it disappear. If there was already a video circulating online, the damage, if it was damage, had already been done. He needed to understand what he was dealing with before he could decide how to respond. "Did she leave a number?" he asked, and Tommy pulled a business card from his shirt pocket. "Sarah Williams, staff writer, San Antonio Express News." The card included a phone number and email address, along with the newspaper's downtown address. James studied it for a long moment, trying to decide whether the woman's profession made the situation better or worse. At least journalists had professional standards and ethical guidelines, unlike random people with smartphones who might post videos for entertainment value. "I'll think about it," he said, tucking the card into his wallet. Tommy stood to leave, then turned back as if he'd just remembered something important. "For what it's worth, the people who've been asking about you seem respectful, like they're fans of the music, not just curious about your situation. That's got to count for something." After Tommy left, James found it difficult to focus on his playing. Every person who walked through the square seemed like a potential threat to his privacy. Every phone that appeared in his peripheral vision felt like an invasion. He managed to get through 2 songs before giving up and packing his guitar away, something he'd never done in all his months of coming to Heritage Square. The walk home felt different too, as if the familiar streets had become a stage where he might be recognized or approached by strangers. James had experienced similar feelings during his first months back from Afghanistan, when crowded places and unexpected noises could trigger flashbacks to combat situations. He thought he'd moved beyond that level of hypervigilance, but the knowledge that he'd been recorded without his consent had awakened old patterns of mistrust and anxiety. Back in his apartment, James found himself pacing the small living room, trying to process what he'd learned and decide how to respond. Part of him wanted to call Dr. Martinez immediately, to schedule an emergency session to work through the unexpected disruption to his routine. But another part of him, the part that had learned to be self-reliant during his military service, insisted that he should handle this on his own, at least until he understood the full scope of the situation. He sat down at his laptop and searched for his own name, combined with terms like veteran, singing, and San Antonio. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. The video had been viewed more than 50,000 times across various social media platforms. It showed him performing Amarillo Morning with a clarity and intimacy that made him feel as if he were watching someone else's private moment. The comments section was filled with responses that ranged from genuine appreciation for his musical ability to expressions of sympathy for his obvious struggles. "This man's voice carries so much pain and beauty. Thank you for your service, brother. Your music touched my heart. I hope someone helps this veteran get the recognition he deserves. My husband served 3 tours in Iraq. This could be him singing in our backyard. God bless." James scrolled through dozens of comments, feeling simultaneously grateful for the support and horrified by the exposure. These strangers were responding to the most vulnerable part of himself, the part that he shared only with his guitar and the empty spaces where no one could judge or pity him. But buried among the sympathetic responses and praise for his musical ability, James found something that made his pulse quicken with an entirely different kind of anxiety. Someone had shared the video with a comment that read, "This needs to get to George Strait. He should see what his music means to people." The comment had been liked and shared dozens of times, with other users adding their agreement and tagging accounts associated with George Strait's management and record label. James felt a wave of panic wash over him at the thought of his musical hero seeing him in such a raw, unguarded moment. George Strait represented everything polished and professional about country music. James was just a broken veteran trying to hold himself together with songs and string arrangements. His phone rang, startling him out of his spiral of anxious thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Martinez's office number, and James realized with a start that he'd missed his weekly appointment while he'd been absorbed in researching the video. "James, I just wanted to check on you." Dr. Martinez's voice was warm but concerned. "You missed our session today, which isn't like you." "I'm sorry, Dr. Martinez. Something came up." James sank into his armchair, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the morning's discoveries. "Are you all right? You sound stressed." James found himself explaining the situation to his therapist, describing his discovery of the video and his conflicted feelings about the unexpected attention. Dr. Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped James organize his thoughts. "It sounds like this has triggered some anxiety about privacy and control," she observed when he'd finished. "Those are understandable concerns, especially given what you've shared about your need for safe spaces." "I don't know what to do," James admitted. "Part of me is angry that someone recorded me without permission, but part of me is, I don't know, maybe a little glad that people are responding to the music." "Those feelings don't have to be mutually exclusive," Dr. Martinez said gently. "You can be uncomfortable with how this happened while still appreciating that people are connecting with your art." They talked for another 20 minutes, developing strategies for managing the anxiety while also exploring the possibility that the exposure might lead to positive opportunities. Dr. Martinez suggested that James contact the journalist to learn more about her intentions and the scope of the video's distribution, approaching the conversation as information gathering rather than confrontation. "Remember, you have agency in this situation," she reminded him before they ended the call. "You get to decide how much or how little you want to engage with the attention this has brought." That evening, James drafted and deleted several text messages to the number on Sarah Williams's business card. Each version sounded either too angry or too passive, and he struggled to find the right tone for a conversation he'd never imagined having. Finally, he settled on something simple and direct. "This is James Mitchell. I understand you've been looking for me. We should talk." The response came back within minutes. "Thank you for reaching out. I know this must be overwhelming. Would you prefer to meet in person or talk by phone? They arranged to meet the following morning at a coffee shop near James's apartment, neutral territory that would allow him to leave easily if the conversation became uncomfortable. Sarah Williams suggested they meet early, before the morning rush, which James appreciated for both its consideration of his privacy and its recognition that he might be more comfortable with fewer people around. That night, James lay awake thinking about the strange turn his quiet life had taken. For months, he'd been working toward a kind of stability built around routine, predictability, and the gradual healing that came from small daily victories. Now he felt as if he'd been thrust onto a stage he'd never asked to occupy, with an audience he'd never intended to attract. But mixed in with the anxiety and uncertainty was something else. A tiny spark of curiosity about what might be possible if he could find a way to share his music more intentionally. The comments on the video had shown him that his songs could reach people who understood something about struggle and healing, who heard in his voice echoes of their own experiences with loss and recovery. As he finally drifted towards sleep, James found himself thinking about George Strait, wondering if the country music legend had indeed seen the video, and, if so, what he might have thought about this unknown veteran singing his songs in an empty city square. It was a question that both terrified and intrigued him, representing possibilities that he wasn't sure he was ready to consider but couldn't quite dismiss. Tomorrow's conversation with Sarah Williams would provide answers to some of his questions, but James suspected it might also raise new ones about who he wanted to be and what he was willing to risk in order to move forward. The Grind Coffee House occupied a corner spot in a converted Victorian house about 6 blocks from James's apartment. Its mismatched furniture and local art creating the kind of atmosphere that attracted freelancers, students, and people who needed a quiet place to have difficult conversations. James arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of military habit and partly because he wanted to choose his seat and get a feel for the space before Sarah Williams arrived. He selected a table near the back wall, positioning himself so he could see the entrance while keeping his back to solid wood rather than open space. The choice was automatic, a product of training and experience that had taught him to always maintain situational awareness. He ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin that he had no intention of eating, then spent the remaining time observing the other customers and trying to manage his anxiety about the upcoming conversation. Sarah Williams arrived exactly on time, and James recognized her immediately from her brief appearance in his peripheral vision during the past few weeks at Heritage Square. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her late 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair and the kind of practical clothing that suggested she took her job seriously without feeling the need to overdress for it. "Mr. Mitchell?" She approached his table with a cautious smile, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm Sarah Williams. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Her handshake was firm but brief, and she waited for his invitation before taking the seat across from him. James appreciated both gestures as signs that she understood the power dynamics of their situation and was making an effort to let him control the interaction. "You can call me James," he said, studying her face for signs of the aggressive curiosity or manufactured sympathy that he'd learned to expect from people who wanted to turn his experiences into content. What he saw instead was something that looked like genuine nervousness, as if she was as unsure about this conversation as he was. "I imagine you have questions," Sarah said, pulling a notebook from her bag, but leaving it closed on the table. "I want you to know up front that I recorded you without your knowledge, and I understand why you might be upset about that." The directness of her admission surprised him. James had been prepared for deflection or justification, not an immediate acknowledgement of what felt like a violation of his privacy. "Why?" he asked simply. Sarah took a sip of the coffee she'd ordered at the counter, seeming to gather her thoughts before responding. I was working on a story about how downtown green spaces are used by the community. Heritage Square was one of the locations I was supposed to visit. When I got there and heard you playing, She paused, searching for the right words. I've been a journalist for 5 years, and I've learned to recognize when something special is happening. Your music, the way you performed those songs, it was extraordinary. I started recording because I didn't want to lose the moment. But you posted it online without asking me. James kept his voice level, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. I did. And I've been wrestling with whether that was the right choice ever since. She leaned forward slightly, making eye contact in a way that suggested she wasn't going to hide behind professional distance. I grew up listening to my grandfather's stories about World War II. He came back from the Pacific with what we now know was PTSD. But back then, it was just called being different or troubled. He never talked about the war directly, but I could see how it affected him every day of his life. Sarah paused, and James sensed that she was sharing something personal rather than manipulating him with a calculated appeal to sympathy. When I watched you perform, I recognized something in your music that reminded me of my grandfather's paintings. He started painting landscapes after the war, these beautiful, lonely scenes that somehow captured feelings he couldn't put into words. Your songs felt the same way, like you were working through emotions that were too big for regular conversation. James found himself listening with more openness than he'd expected. The comparison to art as therapy resonated with his own experience, and Sarah's reference to her grandfather suggested she might understand something about the long-term effects of military service. I posted the video because I thought other people might connect with what you were doing, she continued. Veterans, music lovers, people who understand what it means to find healing in art. I wasn't thinking about your privacy, and I should have been. How many people have seen it? James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from his own research. About 75,000 across all platforms as of yesterday. Sarah's expression showed that she understood the magnitude of what that number meant for someone who valued his anonymity. I know that probably feels overwhelming. James absorbed this information, trying to process what it meant to have his private moments of healing witnessed by so many strangers. The number was larger than the population of many small towns, a community of viewers who had formed opinions about him based on 4 minutes of video captured without his knowledge. What do they say? He asked. The people who watch it. Sarah opened her notebook and flipped through several pages of what looked like transcribed comments. Mostly positive things. A lot of veterans recognizing something familiar in your story. Music lovers appreciating your voice and guitar work. People sharing their own experiences with healing through art. She looked up from her notes. There have been some offers of help too. Musicians wanting to collaborate, venues offering performance opportunities, organizations that support veterans asking if they can connect you with resources. The idea of collaboration and performance opportunities was both intriguing and terrifying. James had been playing music for most of his life, but always as a private pursuit or in small, informal settings. The thought of sharing his songs with intentional audiences brought up questions about his ability to perform under pressure and his readiness to be vulnerable in more public ways. There's something else, Sarah said, and James could hear the shift in her tone that suggested they were approaching the real reason for this meeting. I received a message from George Strait's management team. They saw the video and, well, George Strait wants to meet you. The words hit James like a physical impact, leaving him momentarily speechless. George Strait was more than just a country music star to him. He was the artist whose songs had provided a soundtrack for some of the most important moments of his life. From his teenage years in rural Texas to late nights on military bases overseas, George Strait's music had been a constant presence, a connection to home and to the person he'd been before war changed everything. "You're serious?" he managed to say. Completely serious. His team reached out through social media, then followed up with a phone call. They want to know if he can visit San Antonio to meet you, possibly even perform with you if you're interested. Sarah leaned back in her chair, giving James space to process this information. They emphasized that there would be no pressure, no obligations. Just one musician wanting to meet another. James felt his world tilting in a direction he couldn't have imagined when he'd woken up that morning. The idea of meeting George Strait was the kind of fantasy that belonged in dreams, not in conversations at coffee shops with journalists he'd just met. "When?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Some part of his mind had apparently moved past whether this would happen to the practical details of how it might work. "That would be up to you. His team said they can work around your schedule and preferences. They suggested it could be private, just the two of you, or it could be part of a larger event if you're comfortable with that." Sarah closed her notebook and leaned forward again. "James, I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you in terms of this story. I don't need exclusive access or special interviews. I just want to make sure you have the information you need to make whatever decision feels right." The offer of no strings attached felt almost too good to be true, but James sensed that Sarah was being genuine. Her entire approach to this conversation had been more respectful and less exploitative than he'd feared, and she seemed to understand that his comfort and autonomy were more important than her professional interests. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course, take as much time as you need." Sarah pulled a second business card from her bag and wrote something on the back. "This has my personal cell phone number. You can reach me any time if you have questions or if you decide you want to move forward." James took the card and studied it for a moment, then looked back at Sarah. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. If you were in my situation, what would you do?" Sarah considered the question seriously, taking time to think through her response. "I think I'd be scared," she said finally. "Meeting your hero is always risky because they might not live up to your expectations, or you might not live up to theirs. But I also think I'd regret it forever if I didn't at least try. From what I've read about George Strait, he's known for being genuine and respectful. If he wants to meet you, it's because your music moved him, not because he wants something from you." James nodded, appreciating her honesty about the risks involved. He'd been thinking about the same concerns, the possibility that meeting George Strait could shatter the positive associations he had with the man's music, or that he might embarrass himself in front of someone he'd admired for so long. "There's one more thing I should tell you," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "The video has caught the attention of some veteran support organizations. They're not looking to exploit your story, but they've asked if they can share resources with you. Things like music therapy programs, veteran support groups, maybe some opportunities to connect with other veterans who use music as part of their healing process." This information felt less overwhelming than the news about George Strait, perhaps because it was more directly connected to James's current needs and interests. He'd been working with Dr. Martinez on building a broader support network and connecting with other veterans who understood both military service and the role of music in recovery could be valuable. "I'd be interested in hearing about that," he said. "I'll send you some information later today," Sarah promised. "And James, whatever you decide about George Strait or anything else, I think what you're doing in Heritage Square is important. You're creating something beautiful out of your experience, and that takes courage." After Sarah left, James sat alone at the coffee shop table for another 30 minutes, trying to process everything he'd learned. The conversation had been more positive than he'd dared to hope, but it had also opened up possibilities that felt almost too large to contemplate. He thought about his morning routine at Heritage Square, the quiet ritual that had become central to his healing process. That routine would never be quite the same now that he knew people were watching and sharing his music with others. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe it was time to consider whether his healing could include connections with people who understood what he was going through. The walk home gave him time to think about George Strait and what such a meeting might mean. It would certainly be the most significant musical moment of his life, a chance to connect with an artist whose songs had sustained him through some of his darkest times. But it would also mean stepping out of the safety of anonymity and accepting a level of attention that still made him uncomfortable. That evening, James called his sister Catherine and told her about the day's developments. Her excitement was immediate and overwhelming, and her encouragement to accept the meeting with George Strait was exactly what he'd expected. "James, this is incredible," she said, her voice filled with the kind of enthusiasm he remembered from their childhood. "Dad would be so proud. You have to do this." "I'm scared," he admitted, saying out loud for the first time what he'd been feeling all day. "Of course you are, but you've been scared before, and you've always found a way through it." Catherine's voice softened with the kind of understanding that only came from shared history. "Remember when you were afraid to go to basic training? You almost backed out 3 times, but you went anyway, and it ended up being one of the best things you ever did." James smiled at the memory, remembering how terrified he'd been to leave their small hometown for military service. The fear had been real, but it had also been the beginning of some of the most meaningful experiences of his life. "This is different," he said. "It is different. But you're different too. You're not the same person who enlisted at 19, and you're not the same person who came back from Afghanistan. You're someone who's learned to find healing in music, someone who can touch people's hearts with your voice. Maybe it's time to see what else is possible." That night, James sat on his couch with his father's guitar, working through the songs that had become part of his daily practice. But instead of playing them for therapy or solitude, he found himself imagining what it might be like to share them with George Strait, to have a conversation about music and life with someone who understood both the craft and the emotional weight that songs could carry. The idea still scared him, but it also sparked something that felt suspiciously like excitement. For the first time since returning from overseas, James began to consider the possibility that his story might be about more than just survival and healing. Maybe it could also be about connection, purpose, and the unexpected ways that music could bridge the gaps between different kinds of human experience. He picked up Sarah Williams's business card and studied the phone number she'd written on the back. Tomorrow, he decided, he would make the call that could change everything. The call to Sarah Williams had led to a series of conversations that moved faster than James had expected or felt entirely prepared for. George Strait's management team was professional and accommodating, working around James's need for privacy and his specific requests about how the meeting should be structured. They agreed to a private encounter in Heritage Square, the place where James felt most comfortable and where his music had first been discovered. The date was set for the following Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after James's conversation with Sarah at the coffee shop. The timing would allow for George Strait to fly into San Antonio the night before and return to Nashville the same day, minimizing the chances that news of his visit would leak to the general public or attract unwanted attention to James's usual sanctuary. Dr. Martinez had helped James work through his anxiety about the meeting during 2 additional sessions, focusing on techniques for managing overwhelming emotions and maintaining a sense of agency in what could feel like a surreal situation. She'd reminded him that he could end the encounter at any time if it became uncomfortable, and that George Strait had specifically requested a low-key meeting with no cameras, recording equipment, or outside observers. "Remember that he's coming to meet you," Dr. Martinez had emphasized during their last session before the meeting. He saw something in your music that he wanted to experience in person. You don't have to perform or prove anything. You just have to be yourself. The morning of the meeting, James arrived at Heritage Square earlier than usual, needing extra time to process his emotions and prepare mentally for what was about to happen. The November air was crisp but comfortable, and the square looked exactly as it always did, empty except for the pigeons and the familiar bronze statue that had witnessed months of his private performances. He'd brought his father's guitar, of course, but also a notebook where he'd written down some of the questions he might want to ask George Strait if the opportunity arose. Looking at the list now, most of the questions seemed either too personal or too trivial, and James found himself wishing he'd spent more time thinking about how to have a conversation with someone whose music had been such an important part of his life. Tommy Rodriguez arrived with coffee at exactly 8:30, just as he had every morning for months. But today, there was an additional tension in his demeanor, the excitement of someone who knew he was about to witness something extraordinary. "You ready for this?" Tommy asked, handing James his usual cup with slightly shaking hands. "As ready as I can be, I guess." James accepted the coffee gratefully, appreciating the normalcy of the gesture in what was about to become a very unusual day. "My wife made you something," Tommy said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "She wanted you to have it for luck." Inside the tissue paper was a small wooden cross, simply carved, but obviously made with care. A note attached in careful handwriting read, "For James, with prayers for your special day, from Maria and Tommy Rodriguez." The gift touched James more deeply than he'd expected, representing the kind of thoughtful support that he'd been learning to accept since beginning his healing journey. "Please tell her thank you," he said, tucking the cross into his shirt pocket, where he could feel its weight against his chest. At 9:15, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb adjacent to Heritage Square. James felt his heart rate spike as he recognized that this was the moment he'd been anticipating and dreading for the past week. Through the windshield, he could see two figures in the front seats, but the back windows were too dark to reveal whether George Strait was already inside the vehicle. The driver's door opened first, and a man in his 40s wearing a dark suit stepped out. He looked around the square briefly, spotted James on his usual bench, and approached with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested he was part of George Strait's security or management team. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm David Parker with Mr. Strait's team. He's looking forward to meeting you." The man's voice was quiet and respectful, acknowledging the private nature of the encounter. "He'll be right with you." James stood up, still holding his guitar, and watched as the passenger door of the SUV opened. George Strait stepped out wearing jeans, boots, and a simple button-down shirt, the kind of outfit that could belong to any Texas man on a Thursday morning. But there was no mistaking the unmistakable presence of someone who'd been performing for audiences for decades, a natural confidence that came from years of connecting with people through music. George Strait was taller than James had expected, and older too, showing the lines and grey hair that came with a long career and a full life. But his eyes were warm and alert, and when he spotted James across the square, his face broke into the kind of genuine smile that couldn't be manufactured for public relations purposes. "James Mitchell," George Strait said as he approached, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm George Strait, but I suppose you already knew that." His voice carried the familiar Texas accent that James had been hearing on radio and recordings for most of his adult life, but in person, it was somehow both more ordinary and more remarkable than he'd imagined. "Mr. Strait," James managed to say, taking the offered handshake and finding it firm but not overwhelming. "I can't believe you're here." "Well, I couldn't believe what I heard in that video," George Strait replied, his eyes moving to the guitar in James's other hand. "That was some of the most honest singing I've heard in years." When my team told me about the veteran who was performing my songs in a San Antonio park, I knew I had to come meet you myself." The directness of the compliment left James momentarily speechless. He'd imagined this conversation dozens of times over the past week, but in all his scenarios, he'd never quite believed that George Strait would be genuinely impressed with his amateur performances. "Would you mind if I sat and listened to you play?" George Strait asked, gesturing toward the bench where James had been performing for months. "I promise I'm not here to judge or critique. I just want to hear your music in the place where you've been creating it." James nodded and returned to his usual spot on the bench, but everything felt different with George Strait settling into the space beside him. The square suddenly seemed both larger and smaller than usual. Larger because of the significance of what was happening, smaller because it had become an intimate space shared between two musicians who understood something about the power of song. "What would you like to hear?" James asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Whatever you feel like playing," George Strait said. "I'm not here as a fan asking for requests. I'm here as someone who heard something special in your music and wanted to experience it firsthand." James closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself and remember why he came to Heritage Square every morning. It wasn't for performance or recognition. It was for healing, for connection with something larger than his immediate circumstances. If that was what had moved George Strait to make this trip, then that was what he should share. He began with "Amarillo Morning," the song that had been featured in Sarah Williams's video and that had become something like a personal anthem during his months of recovery. As he sang, James found himself forgetting about his audience of one and returning to the emotional space that the song represented, longing for open spaces, for simpler times, for the person he'd been before war changed everything. When he finished, George Strait was quiet for a long moment, and James worried that perhaps the performance hadn't lived up to expectations. But when the country music legend finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that suggested he'd been genuinely moved by what he'd heard. "Son, that was beautiful," George Strait said simply. "You've got something special in your voice, something that can't be taught or manufactured. It comes from having lived through things that most people never experience." They talked for the next hour, and James discovered that George Strait was as generous with his time and attention as he was with his praise. The conversation ranged from technical aspects of guitar playing and vocal technique to broader questions about the role of music in processing difficult experiences. George Strait shared stories about his own relationship with music, the songs that had sustained him through various challenges, and his deep respect for military service members and their families. "Music has always been my way of making sense of the world," George Strait said at one point. "When I can't find words for what I'm feeling, I can usually find them in a song, or at least get close enough that the feelings don't feel so overwhelming." James found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected, sharing details about his military service, his injuries, and his struggle to find purpose and meaning in civilian life. George Strait listened without judgment or the kind of manufactured sympathy that James had learned to expect from people who wanted to appear supportive without truly understanding. "Have you ever thought about recording your music?" George Strait asked as their conversation began to wind down. "Not for commercial purposes necessarily, but just to preserve what you're creating here." The question was one that James had been avoiding, partly because he wasn't sure he was ready for the kind of exposure that recording might bring, and partly because he wasn't convinced that his music would translate well outside the specific context of Heritage Square. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "But this place, this routine, it's been so important to my healing. I'm not sure I'm ready to change that yet." George Strait nodded with understanding. "That makes perfect sense, but if you ever do decide you want to explore that possibility, I'd be honored to help. No pressure, no obligations, just one musician helping another." As their time together neared its end, George Strait made an unexpected request. "Would you mind if I played something for you?" he asked, gesturing toward James's guitar. "I don't get many opportunities these days to play for an audience of one in such a beautiful setting." James handed over his father's guitar, and George Strait spent a moment adjusting the tuning and getting familiar with the instrument. Then he began to play Troubadour, one of his more recent songs about the life of a traveling musician and the connections that music could create between strangers. Hearing George Strait perform live, just for him, in the same square where James had been working through his own healing, felt like a moment that belonged in dreams rather than reality. The song took on new meaning in this intimate setting, becoming less about the romance of the musical life and more about the authentic human connections that could emerge when people shared their art honestly and openly. When the song ended, George Strait handed the guitar back to James with a smile. "Thank you for sharing your music with me," he said. "And thank you for your service to our country. What you're doing here, using music to heal and connect, that's important work too." They exchanged contact information, and George Strait left James with an open invitation to reach out if he ever wanted to discuss music, recording opportunities, or just needed someone who understood the particular challenges of turning personal experience into song. As the black SUV pulled away from Heritage Square, James sat alone on his bench, trying to process what had just happened. Tommy Rodriguez appeared as if he'd been waiting for the right moment, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "So," Tommy asked, settling onto the bench beside James, "how was it?" "Surreal," James said, accepting the coffee gratefully, "and wonderful, and terrifying, and—" He paused, searching for words that could capture the complexity of the experience. He was exactly what I hoped he'd be. Genuine, respectful, interested in the music for the right reasons. "What happens now?" Tommy asked. It was a question that James had been asking himself since George Strait's SUV had disappeared around the corner. The meeting had exceeded his best-case expectations, but it had also opened up possibilities that he wasn't sure he was ready to explore. Recording opportunities, performance venues, connections with other musicians. All of it felt both exciting and overwhelming. "I don't know," James admitted, "but I think maybe that's okay. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have choices, like there might be more to my story than just surviving and getting by." That evening, James called Catherine to tell her about the meeting, and her excitement was infectious. She peppered him with questions about every detail of the conversation, and her enthusiasm helped him realize how significant the day had been, not just as a meeting with a musical hero, but as a step toward imagining a future that included more than just private healing. He also called Dr. Martinez, who listened with professional interest as he described his emotional responses to the experience. She helped him identify the ways that the meeting had reinforced his sense of self-worth and opened up new possibilities for connection and purpose. "It sounds like this experience confirmed something important," she observed, "that your music has value beyond just personal therapy, that it can touch other people and create meaningful connections." That night, James sat in his apartment with his father's guitar, playing through the songs that had become part of his daily routine. But something had shifted in his relationship with the music. It was still therapeutic, still a crucial part of his healing process, but it had also become something that could be shared, something that could create bridges between his experience and the experiences of others. He thought about Sarah Williams, who had taken the risk of sharing his story with the world, and about the thousands of people who had responded to his music with understanding and appreciation. He thought about George Strait, who had traveled to San Antonio simply to acknowledge the value of what he was creating in Heritage Square. Most importantly, he thought about himself and the gradual recognition that his journey might be about more than just recovering from what he'd lost. Maybe it could also be about discovering what he still had to offer, about finding ways to transform his experience into something that could help others who were fighting their own battles with isolation and pain. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, James felt ready to consider possibilities that extended beyond the boundaries of Heritage Square and the safety of his morning routine. The healing would continue, but it might now include helping others heal as well, one song at a time.